Sarita Jolene?
Yes,
Sorry.
I'm going to start the session.
Okay, good.
Mhm.
Shall we count now? Yes. Good. I think everything is set. Shall we start, Sarita?
Yes, all set.
Great. Thank you.
Mhm.
Okay, let's go. Ladies and gentlemen, good morning, good afternoon, good evening, depending where you are. I'm Ana Lucia Jacome, Senior Project Leader and Human Rights Expert at the UNITAR's Division for People and Social Inclusion. I remain at your disposal in case you want to explore possible synergies on aging and older persons learning initiatives. We are back. Today we are starting with the fourth year of our virtual roundtable series, Mainstreaming Knowledge on Aging. This year will be the opportunity to learn on advancing the human rights of older persons in times of converging crisis. We will address critical issues affecting older persons, including the right to work, healthcare, technology, legal protection, and food security in times of peace and war, the human rights of older persons and frontier issues such as the demographic worldwide scenario, gender, human mobility, digital divide, and climate change will continue as the heart of our discussions. I encourage you, dear participants, to send your questions or comments to the speakers by using the Q&A Zoom tab. For the welcome remarks, I have the pleasure to warmly welcome our dear colleague, Dr. Ebru Kanan Sokulu, Deputy Director at the Division for People and Social Inclusion and Deputy Director of the International Training Centers for Authorities and Leaders, CIFAL Global Network. Okay, so please, Ebru, you have the floor.
Thank you very much, Ana Lucia. Thank you very much. It's a great pleasure for me to be here in this fourth year of this wonderful training program. Dear participants, esteemed panelists, it's my pleasure to join you today. Welcome all. And as Ana Lucia mentioned, this roundtable series represents a crucial opportunity for capacity building among diverse stakeholders. And you know, as UNITAR, our mandate is to capacity building. And that's why we value this particular program very much for several reasons, but also for the way that we can contribute into the capacity building in the most effective ways. So effective protection and promotion of the right to work for these groups requires a multifaceted approach, demanding enhanced knowledge, of course, and skills across various sectors. So we cannot achieve this very challenging task alone. That's why it requires us from our end to bring together all different stakeholders from public sector, from private sector, international organizations, academia, and of course, civil society. Our key focus of the capacity building effort in this particular theme must be, of course, on addressing systemic ageism and discriminatory practices that prevent older individuals from accessing decent work. I'm coming from a part of the world that the aging population and older people is a large group of my country. I'm coming from Turkey, and it's great to see also in different parts of the world where you know, in terms of the demographic change, the aging population is receiving more and more attraction and attention from the public sector as well. So this is great to see that at least at the policymakers level, capacity building initiatives contribute to its first target, to create awareness and reaction. This event and of course the broader roundtable series, as Ana Lucia, my colleague, mentioned, aim to build a sustainable network of professionals. We're committed to work in this field to advance the rights of older persons in vulnerable situations across the world. And our tool is, of course, sharing the knowledge and fostering collaboration and developing practical solutions. And in the end, the ultimate task is to create a collective action in this very challenging context. So let me reaffirm our commitment from Unitar's end to upholding the right to work for all, regardless of age and or legal status. And by working together, we can create a synergy. And of course, beyond creating the synergy, we can create an impact. So this is our ultimate task. I don't want to take too much time of yours because we are very much eager to attend a great list of panelists here. We have the privilege of having Ambassador Luis Gallegos. Thank you very much for being our mentor and leader in this endeavor. Dr. Chitra Mary Messi, Mr. Ricardo Pla Cordero, Mr. Alejandro Bonilla, and we will leave the floor finally to Hezi Smith. So we're looking forward to a very fruitful discussion and learning from this brilliant panel. Thank you very much. And of course, my last thanks go to my colleagues who make this gathering possible. So thank you all. Back to you, Ana Lucia.
Thank you very much, dear Ebru, for your valuable insights. And without further ado, I have the honor to warmly welcome His Excellency Ambassador Luis Gallegos, President of UNITAR's Board of Trustees, and he is President of the Global Initiative for Active Aging Foundation, GIA. He's an Ecuadorian diplomat with more than 50 years of experience. He's former Ecuadorian minister of Foreign Affairs, former permanent representative to the UN in Geneva and New York, among other posts. He was the former chair of the ad hoc committee on a comprehensive and integral international convention to promote and protect the rights and dignity of persons with disabilities, among other wonderful tasks that you have been working on, Ambassador. So please, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Ana Lucia. Thank you very much for your very thoughtful and nice introduction. I have to thank you very personally. And also to Professor Ebru. Distinguished panelists, ladies and gentlemen, it is a great pleasure to join this important discussion as we embark on the 4th year of the virtual roundtable series, Mainstreaming Knowledge on Aging. This gathering reflects our collective commitment to upholding the rights and amplifying the voices and valuing the contributions of older persons in our societies. We reaffirm our resolution to address and break up the barriers and forms of exclusion that older persons continue to face in times of crisis and peace. Today's discussion brings attention to the topic of deep significance, the right to work for older migrants, refugees, and stateless persons. For older persons, we have experienced displacement, the loss of home, the stripping away of legal identity. The right to work is not merely an economic concern, but a matter of dignity, belonging, and social inclusion. Around the world, we are witnessing unprecedented levels of forced displacement and protracted statelessness. By June 20, have been forcibly displaced due to conflict, persecution, and violence. Older refugees now represent around 4% of the overall population of concern to UNHCR. And by 2050, the number of people over 60 will exceed those under 12. Older migrants, refugees, and stateless persons constitute a uniquely vulnerable group, facing compounded challenges where age, displacement, legal invisibility, and social exclusion intersect. However, it is important to recognize that they are not merely recipients of aid. Older persons are guardians of tradition and bearers of knowledge, who bring a wealth of skills and resilience and experience to the communities. The economic and social inclusion of older migrants, refugees, and stateless persons can strengthen social cohesion, contribute to community resilience, and counter harmful stereotypes about aging and migration. The right to work, as enshrined in Article 23 of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, affirms every individual's entitlement to employment, free choice of work, just and favorable conditions, and protection against unemployment. Yet many older persons are too often denied this right. The right to work is fundamental. Systemic ageism, restrictive labor markets, and inaccessible legal pathways, they bear the dual burden of age-related discrimination and barriers linked to their migration status or lack of nationality. Stereotypes suggesting that older persons are less adaptive, productive, or technologically capable, combined with limited employment opportunities and lack of work authorization, further perpetuate their exclusion from the workplace. Encouragingly, the international community is taking steps to address these gaps. In April this year, the Human Rights Council adopted a resolution to develop a binding international instrument on the rights of older persons. This milestone, alongside existing frameworks like the Global Compact on Refugees, the Humanitarian Inclusion Standards of Older Persons and Persons with Disabilities, and the Madrid International Plan of Action on Aging, offer a foundation for advancing meaningful improvement and action. Upholding the right to work for older migrants, refugees, and stateless persons is a matter of social justice and social cohesion. Fair access to employment, empowerment of displaced individuals to gain independence over their life, combats age-related stereotypes, and enriches societies with their wealth of experience and wisdom. To move forward, we shall focus on inclusive labor policies that dismantle ageism and xenophobic practices. Government, employers, and humanitarian actors shall ease access to work permits and develop targeted job programs for displaced older persons. Second, strengthen social protection system. This includes expanding pension access, healthcare services, and community-based support with consideration for the legal and migratory status of older displaced persons. And thirdly, foster intergenerational dialogue and advocacy and involve older persons in peace building, civic life, and community leadership. Dear friends, ensuring the right of work for older migrants, refugees, and stateless persons is a matter of justice and of upholding the values upon which our multilateral system is founded. It is about embracing the full diversity of human experience in our labor markets and societies. By safeguarding their right to work, we reaffirm their dignity, enhance community resilience, and help building a better societies we all aspire. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Ambassador, for your time. As always, it's a pleasure to learn from you. Now, let me warmly welcome our dear colleague, Dr. Chitralek Masi, Chief of Section Rights of Older Persons at the Development Economic Social Issues Branch at the Office of the High Commissioner for Human Rights. She was the regional representative of the Office for the Pacific. She has worked for several years on a range of human rights issues, which includes street children, countering torture, business and human rights, countering discrimination, climate change, supporting youth to engage with and on human rights issues, strengthening national institutions, ability to work with human rights include policy, military, armed forces, judiciary, and establishing national human rights commissions, working with civil society and non-governmental organizations. Please, dear Chitra, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Ana Lucia. You've been very kind and very detailed. Good afternoon, good morning, and good evening, everybody. It's a pleasure to be back on this platform. I want to thank my colleagues at UNITAR for this kind invitation and for including me in this discussion. I'm very delighted to be a part of it. I'm also very happy because we are joined by wonderful panelists. And so I'm been thinking about what I would say. I don't have a written script, but I decided I will go with 5 points. And I am going to rely very much on my colleagues from different parts of the UN and the others to help pull the story together. So I want to begin by saying I want to share a few experiences of mine. As Ana Lucia kindly shared, I've had the privilege and the honor to work in many different countries. And when I think of the topic today, there are certain pictures that come to my mind. And I want to begin first with my first experience of being in a camp. As a very young person working on the Thai-Burma border, it was the first time I had stayed away from home. And it was an eye-opener. We slept on the ground with a thin ground sheet. We were lucky enough to have a mosquito net because we had all come with our own mosquito nets prepared because we were on the camp. I watched the gates open of the camp and the aid trucks came in and they provided salt and bread and rice. And then everything came to a standstill. That was a very confusing moment. It's when you realize that everybody sitting there is simply looking forward to the arrival of a truck that will provide them with the food. And then that's the highlight of their life. Then darkness falls and you need to go to the toilet, a very human need. And you get out of your tent and you walk halfway across. It's dark. It's scary. This is me as a young person with a flashlight and a friend next to me. My question today is what happens if you're old, infirm, and alone? Moving on to another experience, I want to share with you that when I was in Afghanistan, I was very, very fortunate to be in Bamiyan. Bamiyan is the place where everybody talks about the Buddhas and the wonderful statues of Buddha there. But when I went there, I saw a different thing. All the caves in that mountain held people living there. These were people who had been internally displaced from within the country. These were communities who had seen discrimination, who had seen attacks, and some were simply had been forced out of their homes by occupation. And within them, you had very old people who never came out of the caves because it was too difficult to climb up and down the hill. You had children who never got to go to school. And the last story I want to share with you is from my last duty station, which is Fiji. I was preparing for a visit by the High Commissioner, and we wanted to take him to this place which was going underwater. And for the first time, communities had been moved together. And so we experienced firsthand the displacement caused by climate change and the impact it had on the mental health of the entire population, but very specifically the older population, because they were leaving behind a lifetime of memories. There were cemeteries which had held their families, generations of their families that had been submerged under the seawater. So I just want you all to hold on to this because this is the setting in which we are working in. I also want to share with you that, okay, today some of us are sitting in Geneva, some of you are in different parts of the world. But in many parts of Geneva, as you walk around, you see street signs and you see signs of people who've been coming from all over the world and who have been someone very important. What people often forget is that very often these are people who fled difficult, challenging, life-threatening situations and came to Switzerland to live. But they contributed and they did things because the environment was such that it allowed them to contribute to the society they were living in because there was that possibility to do so. Now, moving fast forward, I want to move on to the second point I want to share with you. And I want to begin with what I always say is that it's very important right from the Universal Declaration of Human Rights onwards to remember that human rights, if it has to be summarized in one word, is the word dignity. Moving on to the fact that all human rights are indivisible, interdependent, and universal. There is no question about that. And the second point I want to make is that the lived experiences of older individuals are shaped by the circumstances, their circumstances. It can be within the household, community, and the country. And we all agree that factors such as income, equality, and discrimination play key roles in this context. Moving on to the situation that we are critically looking at is, for example, what is the situation and what are the opportunities available to people? And as His Excellency has already pointed out, it's not a very rosy picture. But why do we talk about the lived reality of older peoples that I try to talk a little bit about when I shut my eyes, the memory that comes to my eyes about families living in caves? It is minus 33 degrees in winters. and you're living inside a cave, and you are not able to go out even to get sunshine because it's too dangerous, or you could fall down, and if you break a hip, there is no medical facilities and resources available to you. So we have to really put ourselves in these positions and say, why is this lived reality so important, and why does it matter? On that, I want to also talk about one simple line, and I will no longer dwell on it. Structural violence is maintained through institutions and policies. And these harmful effects that become so common that sometimes we are all guilty of seeing them as normal. And this is what we need to think about and break. Now, moving on to the human rights framework. I mentioned the UDHR. I'm not going to go into the legal discussion because I know that our wonderful colleague, Hezi Smith, is going to be talking about the legal aspects of it. So I will not go into that. And since I know Ricardo is here from UNHCR, I will just say that it's important to look at the Refugee Convention, and that Ricardo, I'm sure, will be talking a lot more about it. But allow me to talk a little bit about the human rights framework. I do want you all to consider what the special procedures of the human rights legal framework says. We have an independent expert, a special rapporteur on the right of migrants. We have a special working group on different aspects of it. They look at statelessness, they look at asylum seekers, they look at what happens and experiences happen to them. For us, we have seen that inequality and discrimination is, if I can use a very dramatic term, scourge, theatrical, if you want to call it, is a scourge of this existence in this current era. We've made so much progress in so many aspects of life, yet in 85 years of talking about equality and non-discrimination, it's still so far from being the reality of far too many people all over the world. What is one of the biggest drivers of conflict? Inequality. And we have also seen and studied in different resources that even the environment and the impact that we see of climate change is linked to inequality embedded within our lives and societies. There are different actors involved and have a different level of responsibility, but this is something we really have to keep at the heart of what we need to do as we move forward. So let's look at the fact that UDHR talks about equality for all. Everybody is equal, and it talks about human dignity. We are more than 80 years down the road, and we're still looking at it as aspirational. We've come up with the SDGs, the Summit for the Future, the Pact for the Future. We have many things that we are working towards. Yet, that one word, we are unable to say that we've achieved tremendous success in countering inequalities. We have made progress. I'm not denying that, but I still think it's one of our biggest challenges. Now, when we look at different aspects of this, if we just look at the three regional systems, the European Social Charter, the African Charter, and the American Convention on EACR, they look at all of these aspects. What do we say within the, if we don't look at the migrant workers specifically, it has many articles that are devoted to this. But I do want all of you to take, please, a good look at the general comment number 18 from the Committee on Economic, Social, Cultural Rights that makes the basic premises and elaborates on why the right to work is important for us. So I'm going to step back here, and I'm going to go back in my storytelling mode and just say, what is it that each of us desires in life? What is it that all of us, irrespective of where we are, whether we are educated, whether we are a diplomat, whether we are a factory worker, whether we are a homemaker, what is it that we all need and want? Very simple things in life. We want a house to be safe in, housing. We want food. We want good health. And if you unpack health, you cannot have health without food, education, and access. I'm not going into too much detail. I'm just touching the tip of it. So, like I said, all rights are interconnected and indivisible. So if you want a life of dignity within that fundamental set of rights, you have education. For education, you need health. You have education and health. You need food, you need housing, you need adequate infrastructure to support you, and you need access to all of this. And then you need employment. If you do not have that employment, you have a big fundamental block in your life cycle that is missing. So your right to work is a fundamental human right. Why is it so challenging? I was very interested and I looked at what comes up on Google when you say right to work for migrants. And I guess situated where we are, what immediately popped up on my screen this afternoon was a headline from the Telegraph. Oh, and it said the UK government quietly allows migrant workers to take on some tasks. So I opened it to see and understand what were the 3 areas that the UK government was allowing asylum seekers, migrants, and refugees to work in. Agriculture, construction, and care work. What are these 3 areas? These are the 3 areas where it's very difficult to find people to work today. It's interesting, isn't it, that the small population of people that are allowed to work for a certain time have been allowed to work in what is the most difficult. And actually, if you look at it, care work is a very hard, but also a work that requires tremendous skills. So it's a very interesting thing, and one can come at it and look at it from many different perspectives to see how this is working. Is this a nice way of approaching it? I did look at the UNHCR page to look at how many countries actually allow refugees and asylum seekers to work. And Ricardo, sorry if I'm stepping into your area here, but I was surprised to see that 55% of refugees globally live in countries that restrict their right to work. So we know that there are people who have no choices and options and who have left. So why are we making it so difficult for them to live a life of dignity is the question we all need to consider. Because your right to work allows you not only to look after yourself, but it allows you to ensure access to education to your children and other generations. It allows you to give you access to healthcare. It allows you to live a life of dignity. Now, if you look at this, how many people over the age of 65? Over here, if I can just add a little footnote for everybody, we do not have a legal definition of older persons right now that has been universally agreed upon. And I do want to elaborate on this, that within the UN Secretariat, we go for 65 and above. But there are countries around the world where life expectancy is below 65. So who qualifies as an older person in that context? So I think we need some fluidity there. At the moment we have that. We don't have a definitive legal answer there. But just to say that older persons can be somebody in a culture at the age of 55 and above. And so let me share over here some of the demographics that are very important for us to consider in terms of looking at older persons. Age. We say longevity is our success story, right? This has been our big success because we've made good progress in science, in infrastructure, in research. We have more food. We have better food. We have better medication. So we've improved our life expectancy. And then I want to put in parallel to that a statistic that has been, for me, telling a very shocking story. 1 in 4 people over the age of 65 experience loneliness and isolation. What does that mean when we talk about loneliness and isolation? It means that the person's life expectancy decreases. It means that person's vulnerability to violence, abuse, neglect, including financial fraud, access to healthcare, everything is impacted. Now I want to step back to another statistic. We say that 1 in 2 persons all over the world is ageist. What does that mean? Out of the people who are sitting here and who are in this conversation right now, how many of us are guilty of looking at the person next to us and saying, oh, it's kindness is one thing, But how many of us believe that the person may not be capable of doing something? How many of us may be guilty of saying that a person no longer has anything to contribute because they're old? I had a conversation once with one of my colleagues who's an amazing colleague. He's brilliant. He also has a disability, and he told me, we were having a discussion, and it has always stayed very much both in my head and my heart as a stark reality of life. And he said, I'm a contributor right now. I have access to someone who supports me, gives me that, as per the law, I have somebody who gives me that, sorry, my brain has just gone dead. I've forgotten the word, to assist the person for, as required by the law because of his disability. But the minute he turns 65, that resource is denied to him. It is no longer something he qualifies for because he's considered retired. Does your capacity and your capability to contribute turn off like the switch of a button or a tap, turning of the tap? No, it doesn't. We have to accept the fact that aging is the one constant. It's inevitable. We are all aging right from the day we are born, but we are not aging in the same way. It's not a homogeneous process. So how do we ensure that someone who needs support and someone who can actually provide the support are all in a position to be equal contributors to society? And I hope I'm not going over my time, but maybe I will just share two short stories with you as my example to say, there are two examples I want to share with you to add to the contribution aspect of older persons. I want to talk about just touching the Klima Seniorinnen. This is the famous case that was brought forward by Swiss women all over the age of 60 at the European Court of Human Rights, and they won it. These women actually changed the whole legal scenario for the entire world by winning this case, by filing this case and winning this case. And I want to share this as an example for people to understand that older people have a very, very strong contribution to make, and we should make that space for them to do so. And the right to work is linked to that, the right to their possibilities and all. The judgment is considered a watershed moment in international law on climate change. Then I want to share with you an example of when I was very young. I was assigned to UNHCR for 3 months on a special project. And one of the first things I did was, as a true youngster, I walked into the UNHCR shop and I bought myself a t-shirt. It was a black t-shirt, I remember, and it had the picture of Einstein sticking his tongue out. And it said, Einstein was a refugee. And on the back it says, what if the world had turned its back on him? So I want to leave you with that example of Einstein, because Einstein became a refugee at the age of 53. At 54, he was a migrant worker in the US. But if you look at his life story, he was in France, in England, in Switzerland, in Prague before he returned to Germany. At many different aspects of his life, he was a migrant worker. So if you're looking at refugees, migrant workers, and stateless people, we have so many examples before us in people who have really done wonders, as long as they had an environment and a setting and the possibility. And this is where I go back to the structural violence aspect of it. Policies and legislation that allows people to contribute on an equal footing. We are in a challenging situation. I accept that. There are many challenges and many reasons where resources and we can, the politics of it all. But the fact remains that people who have been forced to leave for whatever reason, their places and homes are active contributors. And I just want to leave you with one last argument to say that why these stereotypes and myths around harmful stereotypes around older people and their inability to contribute should be busted. And this is that I'm just going to give the example of the latest country that has been a little bit in the news on taking a rather radical approach to some of the people falling within this category. That 1 in 4 American entrepreneurs who are successful and doing extremely well have been migrants. And out of the 2017, for example, I didn't get a chance to look at the latest, Fortune 500 list companies, nearly half were founded by immigrants or their children. And if we want to look into the modern world today, Instagram, eBay, WhatsApp, SlideShare, all of them have immigrant origins. And I think that says it all, that there is a great potential and possibility. I think we just have to be open to it, but we also really have to, I guess that having the resolution adopted and the fact that we are now at a place where 86 countries, member states of the United Nations, far beyond just the membership of the Human Rights Council, supported strongly the drafting of a new legally binding instrument and made this possible is a message in itself that rights of older people are being recognized. But this is also the time that we all have to get together to make sure that some of these challenging situations, which often get overlooked or perhaps minimized, intentionally or unintentionally, we all need to work together to make sure that they are very firmly integrated and are part of this new legally binding instrument as it is being developed. Thank you very much, and I hope I didn't take too much time.
Don't worry, dear Chitra. There is an interesting saying that perfectly fits your presentation. Experience is the most honest teacher. So thank you so much for sharing from your wide experience. You're giving us a lot of food for thought. Thank you again, Chitra. To continue, it's a pleasure to introduce our dear colleague, Mr. Ricardo Pla Cordero. He has been with us indeed since the very beginning of the series in 2022. He works as protection officer in the Division of International Protection at the UN High Commissioner for Refugees, where he provides technical support on the rights of persons with disabilities and older persons under UNHCR's mandate, which includes refugees, asylum seekers, returnees, internally displaced persons, and persons in situations of statelessness. As a development and humanitarian worker, Ricardo has experience in the design, implementation, and monitoring of human rights programming and in the development of policy and guidance on the rights of persons with disabilities and persons in situations of conflict and disasters. Please, dear Ricardo, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Ana Lucia, and thanks for using that picture, which is maybe 10 years old. We may have to update it. I shared some slides. If they're ready, it's fine. Otherwise, I can speak without the slides. Maybe it's going to be even better because we can keep it more human. And that's actually what I wanted to bring. It's been very interesting to listen to Chitra, and thanks for bringing as well, and to the Ambassador Luis Gallego from bringing some of the figures, right? The 4%, which is an estimation, right? And I will delve into why that is an estimate. And then the less than half of the refugee population being able to access to work. What I wanted to expand a little bit is through the displacement journey, what are some of the situations and the impact of these situations, right? Starting from separation from community networks, from support networks, right? So one of the impressions that we have when we are supporting refugees in border situations, one of the pictures and one of these images that remains with you forever is this the eyes of older persons being completely lost, right? Looking, where do I go? To whom do I speak? I don't speak the language. While if we see, we'll say, yeah, but we can see that in children, absolutely true. We see that in adults. That's not completely true. Why? Because there's mobile phones. This is one of the first things, right? So when we see in the current world, that's a more recent picture, thanks, refugees crossing borders, most of the times they're going to be looking for information, right? And where to go, where to look for information. There will be dozens of QR codes with lots of information from NGOs, UN agencies, etc. And that will be facilitating them access to information and support, etc., while older persons won't have this type of access. What happens that, thank you for the slides, that this will increase their risk for violence and abuse, right? Just to give some anecdotal evidence, which we don't see in very often in the reports. So, for example, in situations where cash is delivered through mobile phones, you may have cash being provided, of course, to older persons as a prioritized group, but not reaching them. And when looking at why this is happening, when we do follow up and when there are feedback mechanisms and proactive, right, post monitoring distribution, post distribution monitoring of what is going on, we may find that, for example, there may be situations of abuse and fraud where older persons have been provided a phone and a SIM card, but little training on how to use it to receive the cash, and maybe someone younger, other person from the host community or a refugee may have changed the SIM cards, right? And preventing equal access. Just giving these little information pills on what are some of the risks that we see. Of course, there's all this support that communities provide, but the support that older persons have at hand in their home countries, right? For example, medication, assisted devices, prescriptions, all that may be lost, may be damaged, may be abandoned, and it may be very challenging to access all this without the adequate documentation, right? So the damage that can happen at the beginning of the displacement may be increasing as health deteriorates throughout the time where older persons are not accessing all these medication or assistive devices, etc., further depleting their capacity to support or to be autonomous. Of course, all this has a strong psychological toll, so that's an important point to consider as well. We may see, again, giving a little bit of a human touch, older persons like being losing all their light, right? Losing all their capacity to discuss, and the interest as well in life, in discovering what is around, which are sometimes early signs of depression. And while full diagnosis is not done, right? Because there's little access to health, you may see how the little engagement and the detachment from what they had is going to have an impact. Now, if we go to the next slide, continuing a little bit with what are the consequences of all this? Well, of course, there are many capacities, and Ms. Chitra already mentioned that are lost, right, to contribute to the host society. But there may be as well more complex issues that stem from all these situations. For example, not having documentation. And sometimes we ask, well, why not having documentation? There may be many children and many adults who do not have documents when they are crossing borders, because they may be lost, because they may be retained by smugglers. There are many reasons, right? With older persons, there is an additional reason, and is that they may not even have them to start with, right? Why? Because a traveling document, for example, a passport, is something that many older persons have never used in many countries, have never had access because they didn't think they would access, but they have to access these type of documents, right? So we come to an issue of actually the basics of having an identity and proof of identity that can provide certain level of protection is lost, and with the next consequence coming closer and closer to what would be issues of employment and autonomy and self-reliance, is that they may have had not only documentation, but actually financial means, and sometimes even pension services or pension systems, right, that were backing up their financial stability. The problem there, again, we come is, well, how do you transfer, how do you access those that support again? And this happens both when older persons are crossing borders, but sometimes as well in internal displacement. As many times there are certain steps, there are signatures that have to be done, the proof of life, there's communication coming home and you're not there, so you cannot access the paycheck, etc. So there are many barriers that come to place to prevent this equal access. And then, of course, the issue of information. Again, when I said at the beginning that we are living in a more and more digitalized world, and of course, older persons, many of them have access to digital technologies, etc., in developed countries, but it's not the case in developing countries or countries affected by conflict, displacement, disasters, etc. Now, to close this first aspect of what is the impact, what is the situation, if we go to the next slide, we have a graphic. This is coming from our previous survey on livelihoods, and I didn't have the opportunity to share the results because it's still being conducted, and the same on the global trends, right? Annually, UNHCR releases a global trends report, etc., and this now being finalized. So there's no data that I can share from there. But I wanted to keep from the previous report this slide because this is very significant, even if it's not easy to understand, but I will just help understanding the first line, right? So these are it's actually about women and older adolescents. So it's not about older persons and their access to employment, but it's about the restrictions they report to access formal employment opportunities. And we see the first line is care, right? So childcare, cooking, cleaning, elder should be older persons, care or support. And it's the biggest, right, factor that is reported. What does it mean? That older persons are conceived and perceived as a burden, right? And we cannot blame women, refugee women on having that responsibility, right? We cannot blame on reporting this, actually. What we can, however, try to understand is how a burden can be transformed into a responsibility, and the responsibility can be shared with communities and states as well, right? So becoming what Ms. Chitra was mentioning, right? Support or personal assistance, instead of becoming only a family responsibility and a burden, becoming a shared responsibility and a state as well responsibility. So providing means to ensure that personal assistance is provided, both making available or more workforce, but not with that intention, right? That would be somehow perverse, right? Only just going to have more workers, but actually to ensure a dignified life for everyone, right? For family members, for other persons, persons with disabilities, etc. So this opportunity, and I don't know if within the participants there are colleagues working for UN Women or gender focal points or working on gender equality. This is a very big opportunity that we need to join, right? The care agenda, the support agenda cannot be transformed into a tool against older persons, persons with disabilities, etc. It has to be a joint agenda where we together ask for equal access to care and support opportunities that are dignified, right? So this, let's say, plays the scenario where we are in terms of qualitative information on what prevents older persons, among many other issues, for accessing employment opportunities. If we go to the next slide, we will see some of the enabling factors, right? This is coming from well, again, our experience in UNHCR, analysis of reports that we do annually on how our colleagues in operations are trying to address all these issues. And what we see is that first, this is something that we repeat always, and it shouldn't stay only as a bureaucratic level, right? Is the importance of data. Without data, we don't make visible people. And data should not be an objective in itself, but just as an enabler, right? So what I mentioned at the beginning, that there is an estimate of 3-4% of older persons among forcibly displaced populations. This is actually an estimate, which is somehow reliable because there's more and more states providing information disaggregated by age, but it's not always the case, and even less by gender, and known zero for disability, right? So UNHCR has its own estimates based on our own registration systems on progress. That is one for countries where UNHCR is made responsible to register refugees. But it's not the case in all countries, right? The primary responsibility, the duty of registering and providing international protection to asylum seekers and refugees is the state. And many states have functioning systems. The issue is, again, the level of registration, the accuracy of data, and then sharing this data, right? So this is a call to share more reliable data on disaggregated by age, gender, and if possible, disability. Is more and more possible to do so with the Washington Group questions. So we can have a better picture on who is accessing systems, protection systems, and then social protection and employment, etc. Of course, to access this level of information, then there will be opening avenues for regularization, documentation, right? People who do not have documents do not exist formally, right, for the state. And that prevents the rest of coming rights, right? From stateless persons, but of course as well, what I mentioned at the beginning, all the refugees, asylum seekers who have lost their documents or have invalid documents in country. And there's a difference, right, between being illegal and having an invalid document, right? A person who deserves international protection should not be called illegal, should be called a person requiring international protection, refugee and asylum seeker, and may have documents, but those are invalid, right, in the country, in the host country. So allowing this access to regularization, documentation is a first step to then progress in other opportunities, which includes as well facilitate access to work permits. It's been somehow mentioned by other speakers, but it is an interesting point that I remember now that I didn't mention. It is biases, right? Yes, it was mentioned by Ms. Chitra, for example, in the question on the type of work that is usually facilitated to access by refugees and asylum seekers and migrants as well. However, there is an additional layer many times of discrimination here, and is, for example, in countries as Rwanda, where our own colleagues may put a threshold, right, an age threshold of 60 or 68 to access employment. So that's one. But second is further selecting and narrowing down the type of employment that may be provided as an opportunity. And you may see Again, this is not written anywhere formally, but what factually happens is that older persons finish doing either cleaning work or cooking, right? So those activities that are supposed to be less demanding, but are limiting as well their capacities and opportunities, and not considering that they may have fully fledged skills that remain untapped. Then, of course, there is a much more complex issue, but that still needs to be addressed, and is national social security systems, right? So there are new dynamics of aging population. There's much more mobility. Just to put an example, a privileged example of a migrant worker, as many of us can be in the panel or in the audience. Many of you may have worked in different countries, right? Some of you may have had the luck of working for the UN, where the pension system is unified. But if you have been working for the civil society sector, for NGOs, or for the private sector, you may have a pension in the UK, a pension in France, a pension in the US, a pension in Canada, a pension in Italy, in whichever, Japan, Philippines, wherever you may have worked through the national system, and your pension is atomized, right? How do you claim that in the future? That will be a reality that is coming through us very quickly. Human mobility has been increasing, and that is for a privileged population. Now, try to bring this to a population with little access or no access to their national information, right? Not being able to claim their own information because they may be exposed to risks. How would they be accessing what they have been working for their whole lives, right? There are good practices here. For example, we saw that in Europe, between Ukraine, Poland, some of the neighboring countries, there were agreements, right, to allow access and transfer of pensions and benefits from one country to another, where we can extract good practices, but it's still something that needs to be thought for the entire population as well. And finally, of course, accessibility of information. We cannot rely on a fully digital world. We will have to, for years and years, and probably forever, ensure that information is arriving at least through two ways, right? To ensure that everyone is accessing information. If we keep all digital, we are losing a big chunk of the population. And of course, there's the human factor. Even if information is made available digital, we will many times require a human to process all this information when it's complex, in particular refugee, etc. procedures. And then having equal access to capacity building opportunities. If we go to the next slide, just some of the promising practices to highlight. First, we need to ensure protection, right? So it's many times pointless talking about livelihoods, opportunities, employment if there's no protective environment. So case management has been a priority within the UNHCR, and we have around 40 countries reporting adaptations and support provided to older persons. Still, numbers are low compared to the workloads. I mean, to the population, displaced population globally, but around 52,000 older persons receiving this type of targeted support, right? We don't talk about mainstream, but targeted support. This may include financial support, cash-based interventions, but as well inclusive community-based projects. Here, mobilizing the community becomes very important. And for example, I'm reading from Venezuela, having opportunities for YU waivers, so produce a special, traditional products with a return for investment. This is as well something interesting. Many investors, right, or many colleagues working in livelihoods tend to say yes, but there's always these activities that are very limiting, right, like art crafts, etc. Well, it depends on the return for investment. If there is a good return, first, of course, all the psychosocial aspect, but financially, that investment can be supporting refugees and supporting as well other systems that are being developed, right, for education, etc. And this we've seen in disability, where organizations of persons with disabilities have been growing and growing and becoming sometimes financial structures that can provide loans, provide education, etc., thanks to art crafts or selling lottery, things that we may not think that follow human rights approaches, but is the use, is not the content, right, what matters. And then working as well with national systems. We have a good practice in Costa Rica with CONAPAM, with the National Council for Older Persons, where there's been work to ensure equal access. And just to close, advocacy with the last slide, Ms. Chitra mentioned quickly about the convention. I will not dwell there a lot. Of course, there is equal access to employment, to social protection, Article 24, etc., of the Refugee Convention. But the Refugee Convention was as well reinvigorated through the Global Compact on Refugees, right, which is a political commitment to ensure equal access to inclusion, self-reliance, ensuring as well sharing of responsibilities between states, etc. And there is a specific multi-stakeholder pledge, which is a pledge, which is a commitment, right, by several stakeholders who come together for economic inclusion and social protection. If you're working for a UN entity, an NGO, etc., and you're interested, look for multi-stakeholder pledge on economic inclusion and social protection in the Global Compact for Refugees, and do advocacy to join this and to join for that specific purpose of ensuring equal access to employment for older persons. There's one additional slide with resources, but that will be hopefully circulated by UNITAR. Thank you very much, everyone.
Thank you so much, dear Ricardo, for highlighting some additional challenges that refugees, asylum seekers, and stateless persons face due to ageism. They should not be seen as passive recipients of aid, but as agents of dignity, experience, and change. We will be sharing, of course, as usual, the links that could be useful for participants related to your presentation and further relevant data as part of the takeaways that we will be preparing per event. Thank you so much again. And to continue, I have the pleasure to welcome Mr. Alejandro Bonilla. He is the chair of the NGO Committee on Aging, and also he's the president of the Association of Former International Public Officials for Development, GRACELS. He's an expert actuary with dual Mexican and Swiss nationality, and has a career spanning across public and international sectors. His early career involved enhancing Mexico's social security systems, transitioning to impactful roles at the International Labor Organization in Geneva from 1990, where he promoted social security standards in retirement schemes globally. Alejandro has served in various capacities, including senior actuary and deputy regional director for the Americas and director of the Social Protection Department of the ILO. Now he's leading GRACELS and is the chair of the NG committee. Welcome, please. You have the floor, dear Alejandro.
Thank you very much, Ana Lucia, and thank you also, Alex Mejia, Evrukanan, for having me in this roundtable with so distinguished and younger panelists, many of us being migrants ourselves. Just one clarification, my term in GRACELS just concluded last January. I'm fully committed now on issues of older persons. And well, migration is not a modern phenomenon. It is as old as humanity itself, but there is a group that has historically remained under-recognized. Older migrants, older refugees, and older stateless persons. And while it is commendable to group these women and men, we must also be clear that they face very different circumstances. Policies for the variety of older persons must acknowledge these differences while recognizing their shared potential, positive contribution, as well as their vulnerabilities. It is also important to go beyond the conditions in host countries. Migration and seeking refuge is never only about arrival. It has deep implications for the countries of origin. The causes, violence, discrimination, lack of economical opportunity, and the consequences, family separation, weakening communities, must be addressed if we are to create durable solutions. You know, I'm a mathematician and I hate averages, in particularly when they are referred to persons. There is no such thing as the average older woman or the average older man, even less an average migrant woman or an average migrant man, or an average refugee or an average stateless woman or man. Some migrate as students, many or most as workers, others flee war. Some are legally moving into another country, others illegally, some with families, others isolated, some with disabilities and others not, some highly educated and others not. Some speak the language of their host country, others never learned or will never learn the language. This diversity must be reflected in all policies. A one-size-fits-all approach is not only ineffective, inefficient, it is unjust. Many older women and men arrived young and aged abroad. They spent decades contributing to host countries, paying direct or mostly indirect taxes, raising families, working in essential sectors, legally or in clandestinity, but once they grow older, lose their work capacity or no longer meet legal requirements they face new vulnerabilities. Some are pressured to go back to their countries, which they actually don't know anymore, where they have no rights, where they have no pensions or support networks. The life course perspective must be integrated into all labor and social protection systems. Rights should not follow individuals, not expire with age or employment. And of course, the subject of this roundtable, work is not enough. And it has been mentioned by Chitra and Ricardo and the ambassador. What people need is actually the definition of decent work, which includes fair play, safe working conditions, effective access to social protection, and possibly the most difficult and important thing, a voice. Voice and representation in the same way that for persons with handicap, they tell us nothing for us without us. They're very difficult. It's very difficult to get the voice in a process in a foreign country. Other people, especially migrants, refugees, and stateless persons, must not be forgotten once their working life ends. Decent work also means the right to age in dignity that requires access to healthcare, adequate income, and freedom from discrimination. And well, considering this diversity is crucial to develop a typology that takes into account educational level, access to social protection, and whether the person will or not return home. This will help us and policymakers identify portability gaps and tailor support mechanisms. Special attention must be given to those who have contributed in host countries, but find themselves excluded later in life due to gaps in portability or legal recognition. Social protection must follow people through the whole life cycle and across borders. It's, of course, it's easily said and very difficult done. Ricardo mentioned the case of portability. And of course, we have in Latin America, the case of the Ibero-American Agreement on Social Security. But we have to take note that even in Europe, where every country has a multi-pillar social security scheme, not all pillars of the schemes are transferable to another European country. Even in Europe, there is a very important lobbying and a lot of work to do to ensure portability in Europe with all its resources and with all its means. Another important issue is temporality. Some migrated, as I mentioned before, for work, others settled long-term. Many aged in place, becoming more vulnerable as their legal and social ties weaken. Pensions and entitlements are often not portable. Gaps in bilateral or regional agreements can leave older persons without coverage in either host or origin countries. Cross-border continuity of rights is essential to ensure dignified work and aging for all mobile individuals. Migration has a cost at home too. Families are separated, elders are left without caregivers, communities lose skilled and caring individuals. The root causes of migration and displacement, poverty, conflict, inequality must be tackled, not ignored. If we ignore the developmental lens, we miss half of the picture. Even well-designed policies often fail in practice. Legal residency and right to work can be difficult to maintain. Access to services and work may be blocked by bureaucracy, language, or even fear. And there are social barriers. Local populations, and in particularly union representatives and workers, may see older migrants and older migrant workers or older refugees as a burden or unfair competition, which is worse. Overcoming these obstacles requires more than laws. It demands public education, inclusive service design, and political will. Policies must not only be right, they must be implementable and accepted by communities. Two urgent needs stand out, in my opinion. First, we must gather and share good data, as it was mentioned by Ricardo. Policymakers need evidence to make informed decisions. Second, we must raise basic policy literacy about older pension issues, including literacy on access to work and health among decision makers, whether in parliaments, ministries, municipalities, and civil society. You cannot protect or legislate what you do not understand. Investing in knowledge is a demographic necessity. Older migrants, refugees, and stateless persons are not invisible. They are our neighbors, caregivers, and sometimes even founders of communities. They deserve not only recognition, but protection. Inclusion must be legal, economic, and social. I think that it's really important we all commit to building systems that do not cast people aside once they are no longer productive. We must ensure that dignity does not expire with age or with migration. Refugee or stateless status, all these will certainly be addressed when drafting the legally binding instruments on the right of older persons that Chitra just introduced very nicely, and that was adopted at the recent session of the Human Rights Council. So there is still a lot of work to do, and it's a multi-dimensional task that we are facing. But training, just as this roundtable and exchanging point of views, are really the way forward. Thank you very much for your attention. Thank you, Ana Lucia.
Thank you so much, Alejandro. We truly appreciate your time and the wide experience. And now it's a big pleasure to warmly welcome Dr. Jesse Schmidt. He's the Director of Advocacy Initiatives at Harvard Law School Project on Disability. He has worked closely with self-advocacy and persons with disabled people's organizations, both in the US and abroad, to advocate, research, and produce awareness-raising materials. His Spanish, English, and Bangla language materials have shaped disability rights, strategic litigation, and important decisions by national and regional courts. And his disability rights scholarship has appeared in collections published by Cambridge University Press and Oxford University Press as well, both at the US and international law reviews. So please, dear Jesse, the floor is yours, so you can proceed with the analysis on the legal obligations and responsibilities for older persons at international level on the specific topic we are covering today. Please.
Thank you so much to UNITAR and the whole team and the many other event organizers and co-sponsors for this opportunity to contribute to what I really find is a really challenging and complex human rights intersection. A confluence of issues across the globe in recent years: increased global migration, people are living longer, climates are changing, armed conflicts are on the rise, and just the ever-present threats of political and economic stability really have just underscored the importance of protecting not just the rights of older migrants, refugees, and stateless persons generally, but also specifically the right to work. Ana Lucia, I really coincide with what you said earlier about, reframing older persons, including older migrants, refugees, and stateless persons, not just as recipients of aid, but also as change agents and meaningful contributors to society. And that's why I think this event, which focuses on the right to work of an older population, is so important. As excited as I am to be here, I have the unenviable task of competing for everyone's attention after a slate of highly distinguished and immensely informative speakers and experts. I've learned a lot, and I'm very grateful for the opportunity to have that learning. Instead of what maybe some might expect, so don't run away yet, instead of reciting which international instrument says what in kind of an exhaustive manner on this point, I'll try to keep my remarks brief and center them around a story, so as to provide, an equally engaging contribution to this discussion. I really appreciate what Alejandro said just a second ago about people not being numbers. They're people, and in any kind of discussion of legal provisions, for me, it's really important to tell the stories of the people who animate these provisions rather than just what the words on the page, so to speak, are. So, as we all know, the right to work is a fundamental human right. It's enshrined in multiple international legal instruments, starting with the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. And to varying degrees, these instruments extend the guarantees to a right to work, to older persons, as well as vulnerable populations, including migrants, refugees, and stateless individuals. The intersection of age and displacement status really creates some unique challenges in realizing the right to work. Spoiler alert, sorry, you can leave after this sentence, but I do hope you stay. Spoiler alert, there are not express, actionable, binding international legal provisions that would readily allow an individual at this intersection to seek redress for specific human rights harms relating to this international guarantee of a right to work. So I'll try to argue that through a story. And it, I think, for me, underscores one of the many contributions that a new international treaty on the rights of older persons can make to the ongoing project of establishing a robust and effective global human rights governance. I will, as an attorney, I'm very concerned. I approach this issue with like a slightly specific perspective, and that's I'm very concerned with not just what laws say, but how laws create systems that empower or not individuals to claim or to use the words that are on the page. So I often, approach these questions with the perspective of, if someone comes to me reporting that a right of theirs has been violated, where would I go to help redress that individual wrong? And what mechanisms or what avenues are available for doing that? I'm going to focus, I know several of my colleagues, which I'm grateful to have heard, have discussed briefly the rights of persons with disabilities. At the Harvard Law School Project on Disability, obviously that's the center of our being and the center of everything that we do. And I think that the global project to recognize the rights and protect the rights of persons with disabilities has a lot to teach us in terms of what opportunities they are and what potentially pitfalls we should try to avoid in terms of shoring up gaps in the international human rights framework for the rights of older persons. So I'm going to talk a little bit about a case, an individual communication that was decided a few years ago involving Australia by the UN Human Rights Treaty Monitoring body called the Committee on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities. And that committee is responsible for monitoring the implementation of the Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities. I'll call that convention the CRPD for short, and the committee that oversees it or that monitors its implementation, the CRPD committee. In this case, the CRPD committee applied provisions from its disability-specific treaty to address barriers to the right to work faced by a migrant with disability in a way that might not be readily available or feasible for an older migrant facing a similar age-related barrier due to the lack of comparable treaty provisions that are specific to older persons. I really appreciated also what Chitralekha said about Einstein being a refugee, because I feel like that's or a migrant worker, because I feel like that's a really important reminder for everyone that older persons and migrants and older migrants all have a lot to contribute. And, there are throughout the international human rights legal framework indicia of misconceptions about older persons and migrants and refugees and older refugees and older migrants as recipients of aid or beneficiaries of programs or in seeking relief rather than rights holders, change agents, and contributors. So the case that I'd like to describe to you briefly is called Sherlock versus Australia. It involved a 36-year-old woman with multiple sclerosis from Ireland who relied on a fairly expensive medication, a monoclonal antibody, in order to treat the symptoms of her condition. She was a senior sales executive at Oracle, and had an opportunity to take another better position in Australia, and also at the same time be a little bit closer to family that was making a similar move. She applied for an overseas skilled worker visa, but was denied on the basis as it comes to be on the basis of her disability. Specifically, Australian immigration authorities determined that she did not meet what their migratory regulations require by way of a migration health requirement, because according to their determination, the estimated cost for her treatment for multiple sclerosis would exceed a threshold that the national authorities had set. They call that in their regulations a significant cost threshold. At the time, it was Australian dollars, 35,000 Australian dollars over 4 years, or about a little less than 9,000 Australian dollars per year. At the time that this denial happened, that was in 2013. So in today's Australian dollars, that would be about $54,000 over 4 years, or about 35,000 US dollars for those who think in those terms, or about 13,000, a little over 13,000 Australian dollars per year, or about US, maybe a little less than 9,000 US dollars per year in today's dollars. In other words, from at least my perspective, in terms of the costs of health services that an individual with or without a disability might consume from healthcare sector, isn't necessarily, to me, doesn't stand out as significant, and it, to me, puts a little bit of a lie to the language that's used to determine that threshold. And kind of contrary to what Alejandro had mentioned a little bit earlier about there's no such thing as an average older person or an average migrant, There's an immense diversity within this category. Australian immigration authorities use what's called a hypothetical person test, which is, this very similar idea to an average person test, which basically means that in determining that this individual didn't meet the migration health requirement because her health care costs would exceed the threshold set by the immigration authorities, they did not consider the individual who was a senior sales executive at Oracle, her ability to bear those costs herself. And this is in exclusion of a healthcare bilateral agreement between Australia and Ireland, where the two countries have existing frameworks, unlike some of the issues with regard to the portability of pensions across borders, where they do have a standing agreement and did at the time of the denial to share healthcare costs associated with migrants from either country. So the CRPD committee found that this migration health requirement, violated the CRPD's prohibition on discrimination on the basis of disability with regard to work and with regard to migration under that convention. From the committee's viewpoint, the national authorities had decided that the author or the applicant in this case was denied on the basis of her multiple sclerosis, because this is a provision that the immigration authorities in part because this is a provision that the immigration authorities only apply to migrants with disabilities. So they don't look at the significant or how significant the costs of healthcare that other migrants without disabilities might consume when they're making their determinations. And it also failed to take into account her ability to pay privately for any costs that the immigration authorities feared the national government would incur. So the committee concluded that this provision, as applied to her, amounted to a form of indirect discrimination on the basis of disability that puts Australia out of compliance with its obligations under the legally binding disability treaty, the CRPD. This conclusion probably shouldn't have come as any surprise to the Australian government. Committee, in its earlier rounds of review of Australia's progress towards implementing the CRPD in 2019 and 2013, had specifically called out Australia for this provision and had insisted on it being reformed. And the CRPD committee has not been alone in its critique. The Parliamentary Joint Standing Committee on Migration in Australia, a Royal Commission on Disability-related Issues, and even the Australian Human Rights Commission have called for the government to reform these provisions because of the discriminatory application to people with disabilities. So this author was a younger woman, at least younger than me, and not an older person, by what one might consider for the purposes of protection by an older person specific treaty. But it doesn't take, at least for me, a lot of imagination to think of scenarios such as a slightly older Albert Einstein, where a highly skilled older person whose care, health-related or otherwise, might exceed a quote-unquote significant cost threshold and thus be barred from gaining access to gainful employment in that country or access to that country entirely. Indeed, given the pressures of aging populations across many countries, even if there aren't prohibitions or barriers to migration today for older persons, I don't think it's hard to imagine that there are going to be strong incentives as the silver tsunami or the pressures of aging demographics mount for states to impose age-related restrictions on human mobility, either specifically or explicitly on the basis of age, or because of assumptions about whether that person would be a recipient of aid versus an economic contributor, or through proxy means such as these kind of significant care thresholds. And I think one thing that for me, the Sherlock example also demonstrates is something axiomatic to human rights practitioners, which is that a human right is only as good as the mechanisms that are in place to enforce it. As I mentioned, there are other international instruments that do address to varying degrees the right to work of older migrants, refugees, and stateless persons, but few provide comparable avenues for direct enforcement by individuals of these provisions that were afforded to the author, the applicant in Sherlock versus Australia. I'll touch very briefly on those. Before I do, just to kind of bear that point out, but I do want to say that, the avenues for making these individual communications are by no means a silver bullet, but still they're an important tool in the human rights toolkit. And even though, to the point of these communications not being, and these decisions by UN human rights treaty bodies not being foolproof means for ensuring and safeguarding rights in practice. Case in point, Australia, as far as I can tell, has still to make good on the CRPD's committee's repeated calls to reform its migration health requirement. At least this communication has increased the pressure on the Australian government to do so. And as countries around the world face increased economic and social pressures from the reality of aging populations, it's essential that mechanisms for international human rights governments also create some counter pressure to counteract those the other considerations that states are grappling with. Otherwise, the right to work, livelihood, and economic stability, and the inherent dignity that those things confer for older migrants, refugees, and stateless persons will, potentially be at risk of being swept aside. And likely place to start in terms of where else might an older person facing a similar issue go about asserting a claim or vindicating this right. First stop for me would be the 1990 International Convention on the Protection of the Rights of All Migrant Workers and Members of Their Families. I'll call it the Convention on Migrant Workers for short, the CMW. Article 1, it's one of the few international treaties that addresses the right to work, the rights of older persons, and the rights of migrants, refugees, and stateless persons. Article 1, straight out of the gate, prohibits discrimination on the basis of age, among many other grounds, across its many provisions of this convention. So a great normative protection, right? That's a great right. But there are some more practical issues that would impede someone in seeking to claim this right as a matter of course. So the text of the Convention of Migrant Workers, specifically Article 77, says that you could, in theory, bring individual communications under this treaty, similar to the one that I described under the CRPD, but 10 states parties are required to make a specific kind of declaration when ratifying that convention in order for that mechanism to become operative. Only a handful of states have done so. Thank you to Ecuador, El Salvador, Guatemala, Mexico, Turkey, and Uruguay, but not enough to actually open the doors for individual claimants who are seeking to bring similar complaints of mistreatment on the basis of age in terms of seeking work. Another kind of practical issue with regard to the Convention on Migrant Workers is that unlike the CRPD, it's sadly much less popular. It entered into force in 2003 after 20 ratifying state parties had joined. But then since then, only around 60 states parties, 60 countries around the world have ratified this convention. And all the states parties that have ratified it are generally sources of origins for migrants in the global south. No major Western European or North American countries, for example, which are the important destinations for many migrants and refugees, have ratified. By contrast, the CRPD is over 190 states parties covering nearly the entire world, spanning both the global north and the global south. and over 100 of them have ratified the optional protocol of the CRPD, which allows for this individual communication process to proceed. So a great kind of, words on a page in that norm, in that treaty, but not the same kind of readily available avenues for giving that treaty provision some teeth. There are other places where you could find a right, recognition of a right to work and age, starting with, as Chitralekha mentioned, the Convention on Economic, Social, and Cultural Rights, and specifically General Comment 18, as she already mentioned. And in that, general comment, the committee states that the principle of non-discrimination in that treaty applies expressly in relation to employment opportunities for migrant workers and their families. So very helpful, helpfully addressing this intersection that we're all discussing today. And the committee specifically calls on state parties to the Convention on Economic, Social, and Cultural Rights to create national plans of action in order to facilitate access to employment opportunities for migrant workers and their families. And there's, ILO conventions that talk about the right to work as well. And, even if age isn't explicitly mentioned in, say, the ILO convention number 111 on discrimination in employment and occupation, it does prohibit discrimination on the basis of other status, which may be interpreted to encompass age-based distinctions. And to this point, the ILO has published many studies and policy guidelines kind of advocating for age-inclusive employment practices and the elimination of age-based discrimination. So kind of adding further grist to that mill. But not exactly the same as having an older perspective, individual communication under an older person's specific human rights treaty that recognizes a right to work for not just older persons generally, but also for older persons who are migrants, refugees, or in a stateless situation. The refugee-specific norms, other refugee-specific norms and migrant norms are also important, but there are, kind of similar limitations. I like what Ricardo called, how he described the global compacts for migration and for refugees as a reinvigoration of the convention from 1990 on migrant workers. And just an interesting point, although neither is legally binding in the same way that the Convention on Migrant Workers or the CRPD are, and even though they were adopted at roughly the same time, within days, literally, of one another, only the Global Compact on Refugees specifically addresses the differential barriers faced by older persons in exercising their right to work. The Global Compact on migrant workers, on migrants, doesn't, for whatever reason. So the Global Compact on Refugees specifically says that states will pledge to promote economic opportunities, decent work, job creation, and entrepreneurship programs for host community members and refugees, including women, young adults, older persons, and persons with disabilities. On the other hand, the Global Compact for Migration, which describes similar commitments to fair and ethical recruitment and safeguarding conditions of work for migrant workers, doesn't explicitly bring or call out older persons within those commitments to the right to work. And it's much more common, as Alejandro was alluding to, for any of these international instruments to specifically call out the rights of, or the differential needs for protection of older persons with regard to forms of social protection, adequate standard of living, Social Security, and those things, rather than an affirmative right to work, which, to Ana Lucia's kind of initial point, reflects, I think, some outmoded stereotypes about whether older persons who are migrants, refugees, and stateless persons, are potential economic contributors, or whether they're going to be net takers, so to speak, from the societies that they're immigrating and migrating into. I hope that I've through this kind of story that I've illustrated an area or a way in which an emerging treaty on the rights of older persons could try to fill in some of the gaps that I perceive there to be for an older migrant like Miss Sherlock to avail of or to claim her right to work and to economic opportunity on an equal basis with others, should someone encounter an age-related barrier to accessing that right in a country that ratifies that treaty. I'm really grateful for this opportunity to kind of just point to the need, I think, for something for a treaty provision on point, so that someone in Miss Sherlock's shoes who's older and facing an age-related barrier could bring a similar communication in the future. Thank you so much. And with that, I'll turn it back over to Ana Lucia.
Thank you, Jesse, for spreading hope through jurisprudence cases that show us how to move from theory to practice in the evolution of laws. And dear speakers, dear participants, thank you so much for being with us today. Our second event of our series will be focused on access to health systems for older persons in conflict areas, and it will take place on Thursday, 19 June, and it will be at the same time, 3:30 CEST and 9:30 New York time. So thank you so much once again, and we look forward to welcoming you in the next event. Thank you. Have a great afternoon.
Thank you.
Thank you. Bye-bye. Thank you.
Thank you.
My friend, thank you so much for joining.
Thank you. Pleasure. See you soon.
See you, my dear. Take care.